Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be discussing the international development of non-universal human rights. Human rights are rights that are fundamentally granted and applicable to every single human. They're supposed to be intrinsic rights granted at conception. Prior to the acknowledgement of fundamental rights, the rights and privileges were awarded through one's family, class, and culture. Throughout centuries of conflict, mankind has been able to evolve into a more compassionate, pragmatic world. This concept came into actuality around the 17th century during the Enlightenment, and this eventually led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The human rights that relate most closely to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I believe, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This follows in John Locke's philosophy that humans should be intrinsically granted the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the implementation of these beliefs have proven to be quite difficult, explaining why humans' rights continue to remain non-universal to this day. Although the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wasn't created until 1948, it is interesting to evaluate the decisions made by world leaders and governments prior to this document and the ways this affects us now. For example, if you consider early America and the migration of Native Americans, it is clear to see that they were brutally mistreated. It is stated that the Cherokee were given 2 years to migrate voluntarily, at the end of which time they would be forcibly removed. 2 years later, only 2,000 had migrated, 16,000 remained on their land. The United States government sent in 7,000 troops who forced the Cherokee into stockades at bayonet point. A scholar on the topic, Charles River Editors, The Trail of Tears, The Forced Removal of 5 Civilized Tribes, states that private soldiers like myself and the Indians were forced by General Scott to shoot an Indian chief and his children. This can help show the magnitude of the violations that were occurring. The Trail of Tears defines the story of 70,000 Native Americans that were forced to relocate out of southeastern America to the west. The Native American homes were robbed, and many of them died during the Trail of Tears to the west, which today is still considered one of the most devastating, horrific events in United States history. It is important to note that the United States government later provided the natives and their descendants with reservations, tax-free revenue, and other endowments to pay reparations for the crimes committed by the founders of America. As time progressed through the Enlightenment and into the American Revolution, the concept of human rights had progressed drastically. The problem occurred when people disagreed and had their own unique interpretation of these rights, or even chose not to regard or respect them. Consider the mass genocide and death brought about by the world wars. It was clear to see that humanity had reverted on its progress. The violations to human rights were so significant in World War II that the Nuremberg trials were necessary to punish the high-ranking Nazi officials for the mass genocide of the Jewish population. The Nuremberg trials consisted of 13 trials from 1945 to 1949, resulting in the execution of 12 Nazi-related officials. International trials like this had never occurred before, and being supported by the US, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, it was a turning point for human rights and is still considered by some to be responsible for the formation of today's United Nations. Also, if you consider the treatment of prisoners of war during this time, it is unthinkable to today's standards. For example, in Japan there were 140,000 white prisoners, of which 1/3 died from starvation, exhaustion, punishment, or disease. The Japanese military completely disregarded the Geneva Contract, which was recently developed to prevent unhumanitarian acts such as these. However, there were atrocities committed on both sides of the war. On the receiving end of Pearl Harbor, America and President F.D. Roosevelt were shocked by the attacks at Pearl Harbor and forced nearly 120,000 Japanese citizens to move into internment camps immediately. A quote from the scholar on the topic stated that Buddhist practices were heavily regulated and Shinto was forbidden, the Japanese religions. The camp administrators only promoted Christianity, and in terms of violating the First Amendment, freedom of speech was also denied. The internment camps strictly used English as the primary language, and the use of the Japanese language was not allowed, so they weren't allowed to convey their regard for their treatment. By February of 1942, all the Japanese people in America were living in horrid, overcrowded living conditions, causing nearly 1,800 deaths. This was considered today to be an extreme disregard to the right of life, and many still consider those actions unconstitutional to this day. Moving forward, if we look at the controversial issues in modern times, such as the death penalty or justifiable homicide, consider that the legal system is deliberately violating human rights, concepts that are established in our own Constitution. When looking at the statistics since 1973 through 2014, there were over 150 prisoners on death row that were exonerated for whatever reasons and welcomed back into society. The concerns of the death penalty today are related to the Constitution's 8th Amendment on cruel and unusual punishment, and whether or not the methods of the death penalty are satisfactory to that. In 1997, the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights spoke about abolishing the death penalty and establishing it as a violation against human rights. Unfortunately, this did not end up being the result, with 74 countries abstaining from the vote. Similarly, in the United States, we also have laws that permit a person to commit homicide under extreme conditions. The self-defense law stating that if your killing prevents greater harm to innocent people, that would be considered something justifiable if it is reasonable that the victim was threatened. Surprisingly, this is not very uncommon because in 2015 there were nearly 328 justifiable homicides committed by private citizens in the United States. Most Americans are in agreement with self-defense regulations and are more concerned with the morality and application of the process agreeing with the Constitution. It is important to realize that the actions of our ancestors have led us to the current state of democracy and human rights that we have today. Let's now consider the history of our ancestors and how the right of liberty gained popularity and helped us progress to our modern beliefs. Prior to the Enlightenment, it was believed that mankind was best maintained when governed by a monarchy, but as the Magna Carta formed in 1215, revolutions raged throughout the world in a struggle for democracy and equality. The Magna Carta was the first document establishing that free men are subject to law, even the king. Some of these articles have stood the test of time, such as the right to a just and fair trial and the right of religious freedom that we see in our current documents today. The concept of natural law and the development of the Magna Carta led to the foundation of parliamentary democracy in England. This was a great leap for humanity as a whole, but as we entered the Enlightenment, turmoil arose in many countries throughout Europe and parts of Asia, England and France being the most significant for the advancement of humanitarian liberties. Consequently, during this time, John Locke in England and Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France were philosophers involved in the revolutions of their respective monarchies. This led to many other countries following in their footsteps throughout Europe and is today recognized as a major step in the Enlightenment and advancement of human rights. As a philosopher, Locke stood for inalienable rights and thought that all men by nature were free and equal and that these rights were endowed by God. Later in France, Swiss-born philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau became a big influence on the French Revolution and fought for social contracts and the abolishment of discrimination due to his unique view that there was an innate goodness within man. These beliefs later helped extend into the 13 colonies supporting the development of the United States. The United States Declaration of Independence, it was stated that human rights are intrinsic to all people and emphasized on Locke's belief stating that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was a massive change and mainly established that equality and freedoms cannot be delimited by governments, or at least that's what they thought. Continuing on to the pursuit of happiness, it is ironic that the United States can be immediately identified violating their constitutional human rights beliefs with plantationary slavery and also the treatment of the Native Americans as discussed earlier. America went through many trials and tribulations and even fought a civil war over the abolition of slavery. Acknowledge the pursuit of happiness is defined in the Constitution as a fundamental right that allows you to freely pursue your goals and ambitions in a way that makes you happy as long as you're not infringing on the rights of others. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation established by Abraham Lincoln, not all slaves were freed, and the ones that were received harassment and sometimes even died from hunger and disease after being liberated. Following this even further, the Jim Crow laws were established, causing segregation to become a normal part of United States culture from 1876 to 1965. It is interesting to examine this from an anthropologist's perspective. It would be confusing for them to understand why, when only a few decades earlier Americans fought a war to establish rights against this treatment, including the pursuit of happiness. It supports the argument that human rights are not universal and that if these beliefs are to be overlooked by people in power, then we will continue to have an injustice and discrimination in our world. This can be seen even in women's rights. Women weren't accepted into the workforce until World War II, and it was only accepted because it was necessary to succeed. They were denied the right to vote until 1920, and they weren't allowed to fight in the military until 1942, and they served as nurses typically. And there was even a ratification of an amendment on sex discrimination until 1964. Since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, it is clear to see that these outlined rights are not intrinsically granted to people on a global scale. We've acknowledged the history of our ancestors that led up to the modern interpretation of intrinsically fundamental rights, but there is no excuse for these modern violations that occur. Some of these things that we've already talked about include wrongful imprisonment, war crimes, and violation of privacy, just to name a few. I believe that world leaders and governments should be accountable for their actions, and that they should be reprimanded by an international body such as the United Nations to enforce these rules and make sure that countries are abiding by these intrinsically granted human rights. At this time, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.